Okay, so
This is being streamed where?
to the interwebs, to our private YouTube account. So we'll see. We'll see how it works. So yeah, so this is a 1 hour conflated version of the workshop / talk, extended talk, we'll really call it, from RailsConf. So bear with me because I'm going to truncate a lot of the content, gloss over some things that most everybody's going to know anyway, and we'll just kind of go from there. So the kind of areas, so if you didn't know, we're going to be doing an event called Rogue Rails. It's going to be a really good one, October 22nd to the 25th. Make sure you show up. No, really, all of you need to be there. Okay, so one of the first principles to go over is being able to control all of your values with let. And again, I know that we're all familiar with what they're for and how they get used, but this sort of pattern is to actually utilize them 100% of the time to control the value of that you're then asserting against. So one of the really common things to do, and I'll just open up just create a simple spec here. So we'll just do require helper. Okay. This override. So let's say we're describing the user model. You can see it on the left-hand side there. Okay. So one of the really common things to do is to use instance variables instead, right? So I might say first name equals Jim, whatever, Jim. And then I'll say last name equals Bob. Okay. And then I'll bind these into the user, right? So I'll say user new, and then I'll say their first name is first name, and I'll say their last name is last name. Okay. Okay. So then what I could do is I could actually run assertions against this, right? So I could say it expects user first name to equal Jim. Okay. And so in this expectation, a really common practice is to use instance variables instead. There's a lot of argument as to why you would do that, and mostly it surrounds what is the real value of using a let, and the value is a couple of big things. One of them, and I find to be the most valuable, is that an instance variable is going to return nil instead of throw any errors or raise any exceptions. So as an example, when we're talking about, again, this is not about what you're testing, this is how you're testing it. So if you're looking from a testing perspective on being able to have a more solid test case, if, for example, I was to make a mistake like this, right? This won't error out, right? I'm not going to get anything but nil, right? Getting passed in at this point right here. I may miss the fact that I spelled first name incorrectly, right? So that poses a real big challenge because let's say, for example, down here, I change my expectation to it expect to be valid, right? It may be invalid, and it's going to be really hard for me to figure out why. When in the reality is it has nothing to do with the value of Jim. It has everything to do with the fact that I spelled the instance variable wrong. So let's provide a great opportunity to catch some of these mistakes. So if I was to say first name and I was to load the value into this spot, right, and I was to use it here, okay, but I was to spell it wrong, then it's going to throw a no method error. Because that's effectively what a let is doing, is just creating a method that's mapping itself to an instance variable effectively, right? An identifier, yeah. Yeah.
And that identifier has no method attached to it.
Right, right. So this is one of the great use cases for why you would use a let. The other one is it gives you a lot more control over permutation. So you can do nested contexts or nested describes when first name is too long, right? and I can redefine the let down here, right? So I can say it's really, really, really long, right? Whatever it happens to be, okay? And this is going to bubble up the chain. So when it gets called in this context on line 15, now this let up here is going to be overridden by this one down here. So this gives a great opportunity for us to control a lot of these permutations as it continues down the stack, right? Or down the chain. All right, so that's one of the values of using let is going to be that. Now, one of the downsides to using let is that it can be kind of hard to follow along with, and that can be a downside. And that's one of the biggest arguments against them is that there's a little bit of magic happening under the hood, or you may be setting a let up on line 4, but you have a spec that's 200 or 300 lines long, and you're using it down below, and so it's kind of hard to figure out, well, where did it all come from? I think that that's not necessarily a valid argument because it can be equally as complicated using an instance variable or anything else. What Thoughtbot was proposing was that you actually manually set methods, because you can in the context of this example right here, or in any of these, you can actually define a method if you'd like, right? So I could say that the method is first name, right? And then I could do some logic here, whatever, and I could choose to return the name value, right? And so this, the reason why this becomes something that people are choosing to do is, one is it defines a little bit more clearly what the let is doing in terms of it's dynamically defining a method and then setting a marker, right? But in addition to that, you can run additional logic inside of this, right? So I could do more setup inside of this inside of this method that builds potentially the name value and returns that versus what the let is primarily used for inside this block is just setting a value, right, of some kind. But you can actually do all of that inside the let anyway, but it's just frowned upon for the sake of, again, readability, and it's, that the convention that has been structured for it is very different, right? I've tried both patterns. Recently, I actually tried this one here, and it had its advantages in many different ways because there were, it just was a little easier to understand. Like as a Rubyist, when you're trying to read the code, it's like, well, there's not as much magic going on. I can use this sort of convention that I'm very familiar with, and it works out really well. But as Rob put, all of these tools are available to us via RSpec, so why not use them?
Isn't that one right there exactly what a let's doing, basically?
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. The equivalent would be actually this.
A let is actually doing that, yeah. It's an or equals, yeah.
Yeah. Is basically what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when you call it once, it's not going to build it twice, right? Or if you call it twice, it's only going to build it once, build the value once. So another huge advantage to using lets just across the board is that it will help you avoid building objects or setting values that you don't actually use in your test. So for example, let's say we are in this collection of examples, and this is described here, we're going to have multiple expectations. One expectation is going to test against a single user. Let's say, for example, that the first name is such and such. Then we have another that's going to test multiple users. Well, commonly what people will do is they'll do something along this lines, right? They'll create one user. Right. Oops. Create. Right. So they'll create multiple users inside the before, but they'll only assert against one of them. Right. So you're just arbitrarily creating too much when you just don't need to. So one of the values of a let is that that in the example itself, while you're running the actual expectations, it's only going to create what it needs for that use case. So you could have multiple users set up, user with company is such and such, and then you have user without company, and if I only use user with company, then user without company is never going to get called. So that's another advantage to using the let. Okay. I think you guys all know this, but if you didn't know, let bang will create the object prior, or will run that code prior to it running any of the expectations. So that's kind of I've seen this done, unfortunately, in a lot of open source projects. People who don't know that you can do that, and so they actually run this inside the before to simulate that same effect. But you don't need to do that. While at the same time I also understand.
That would be a way of saying of selectively doing it in certain contexts.
Totally,
Yes.
Totally. And that's what I was going to say is that while at the same time as I've had issues, and this is another criticism of using let, is that if you forget to do that, you get all these failures, you can't figure out why, and then you realize, oh yeah, it's because that has not been called yet.
Well, and that right there is easy to gloss over too.
Totally, it's really subtle, really subtle. Totally.
Does let bang always evaluate before the before block?
Yeah.
At the top of the before block.
It evaluates. Yeah, so it evaluates
Right
all of these at this point. So as it's setting all this up, right? So as it's setting the before with the block included, all that stuff. Yeah, it'll run those. Okay, so that's let, as you probably already know. So one of the things that I have done multiple times and have found it really helps keep the code super clean is, and it can be excessive, but I do like it, and that is that I actually work to control all of the values with a let, even those that don't appear to be needed. So as an example, so I'll pull these out of here for a minute. So in this example, let's say for example, this guy. So I'll pull that out for a second. Sometimes I'll even, like this, for example, I would replace with that just so that they match, right? I'm missing up before in there actually, but, well, sorry. So we'll just compare.
You don't need one, right?
Yeah, I'll just do user. Anyway, I think you get the idea, yeah, right. Okay. Right. So just for the sake of consistency, so that I don't have kind of a rogue string hanging out there somewhere, right?
Yep.
Where, let's say, for example, I was to change it to that. Now my test is going to fail, but it's kind of stupid. It's a little bit of an inconvenient failure.
Don't need to test the test.
Yeah. So instead, I would just choose to actually control that value as well, right? It's also preference that when you have a big spec and you've got all of these different tests and values that are going to be passed around and asserted against and all that sort of stuff, that it's kind of nice when you're going to end up with this just massive block of lets at the top. The beautiful thing about it can be just simply that it's really easy to go, okay, well, I know all of the values that I'm working with right now. All of the logic and the use of these values are going to happen below it, but if I want to change any of these, I know what is available to me, so if I go and create a new describe or a new context, I know what I can mutate, and it's going to impact everything above it. This is a pattern that I find to be incredibly useful. So I avoid hard coding any of the values into the expectations. I put all of the values into that.
So curiously, there is disagreement among the elite about whether you should use the let variable name instead of the constant in the expectation. There's a lot of people that argue that you should put Jim there, and I can't articulate at the moment why that would be, what the pros of that are, other than you're looking at, you're explicitly testing against a hard value instead of, you may not know what's happened to the first name value, right, in the process of, although you can't really reassign it. I guess you could.
The only thing that actually came up.
There's a good case when you're testing two values that are supposed to be the same, right? That's a good case of like password and
password confirmation.
Password confirmation. That's a good example of when this might be a bad idea to do.
Well, the bad example would be is if you have, let's say, a password, right? And it's whatever, password, right? And then you're doing.
No, we all know Adam's password.
Right.
See how fast he typed it? It's what he does every day. You can tell.
This is my other. This is a bad example.
That's a bad example. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's different than the expectation.
Yeah. So that actually, what you brought up actually did come up during the workshop, I believe, or it was a little different, but effectively the same thing. And I think that where it comes down to a pattern, and this is what I've determined with a lot of this, is that if you use a common convention when you structure the test, then even though there's an area of human error that could apply to that, at the same time you have some predictability behind, those things. As an example, if my pattern is that I'm going to put all my values are controlled with LEDs and I put them all at the top, and I don't break that pattern, then I have a degree of confidence that I'm not going to run into that scenario where I don't know what the value is of that.
So I think it's great to make that a ZEAL standard. Like, I think it's fine to say, like, let's not use literal values in our expectations.
Well,
if you have the value, that value of
the other thing is you know what you're putting in, and therefore you know what you want to get out. And so if you were to put a string there, there's more room for error in the test.
Yeah. So what I would often see would be line 6 by itself with a literal there, Jim, and then compare should equal to Jim, right? It's drawing those two Jims into an actual attribute value, right? Which I think is probably the way to go, right? In that case, especially.
Yeah, I would agree. So basically, all values. So if even inside of another let, if you're declaring something like user new,
we have been.
You're saying all the attributes should be their own lets?
With
is that
arguably, yeah. Go ahead.
We were doing stuff with request tests though, where you're building up this huge hash of parameters, and I think it would be ugly to like drill down to assert on that hash, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
So if you're using Factory Girl, and we'll probably get to that later, the only attributes you should be explicitly mentioning are attributes that matter that you're going to test against.
Yes.
So in that case, they deserve their own let potentially, right? So I could see that argument. Like, if you're not testing for it, why are you putting it in your attributes list in the first place for that object?
Right.
Right.
Is there a pragmatic situation like what you were just mentioning where it might not make sense to do it?
Yeah, I think in our case we had like nested attributes of, so it was just kind of a ridiculously nested, yeah.
Of the approach.
I sometimes make a let of something arguments or something params, where you're letting a hash of things.
Yeah, that's where it seems like asserting on the drilling down in that hash is maybe
too
a little extreme. But
So one of the other big values to controlling it all on a let actually goes back to.
What did you do?
I just. I'm like,
Wow.
one of the great values is it can become this, like that.
just like Brian Bates, right? I'm just going to paste in this code.
Yeah. So, and that is, if you put everything in a let, then so this goes into extendability, right? And kind of a developer habit. So if I say, when last name is too long, right? And this is a pattern that I'm using, then I know that this is going to be available to me, right? And I also know that anything that happens before it, any setup that is occurring before it, every use of last name is going to be overwritten at this point when I run these tests, right? And there's a degree of confidence with it. If I'm hard coding any of these values, then that safety net is destroyed, So that's why I'm a big fan of putting them all in there, like all of my string values, all my hash values, everything is put in it. And this blog, man, I've written them like for Breeze, for example. Like, this thing got huge. I mean, but it was always in one spot. It was always at the very top. And I could just scan through and go, oh, I get it. So if I needed to mutate one value or two values, I could just do that, and I knew the rest of the test would follow a similar pattern, and it would work. And it did. It did. It would be only when we broke that pattern that it wouldn't, and that was obviously when there's a real issue. And I know, right? Totally. Okay, so control value is let.
We broke the talk into like 5 sections, and
Yeah.
if he started running over, I gave him the.
He did. Or if too many questions got asked. It was real. Okay, another one is descriptive naming. So here's a perfect example, right? User 1, user 2. Do you know what the difference between user 1 and user 2 is?
1.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a very, very valid point. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Quick, this one.
Right. So the other suggestion is that use descriptive naming. So let's say this is your expectation. I expect user 1 to be valid and it's passing, and I expect user 2 to be valid and it's not passing, and I don't know why. So if I'm just scanning through the test and I'm getting these failures, I have to dive into the code to figure out what the difference between the two is. Whereas if I was to change it to this, when I look at this again, I have a sense of where my starting point is. Right.
What's wrong, maybe?
What's wrong? So, so again, it's be descriptive with the naming. Like, never use user 1, user 2. Even if this value becomes fairly long, who cares? That's the whole point of it. And then going along these lines is name everything the same. So if you have a factory with a trait that is user with company or user without company, then in the let use user with company. So you have there's something that's consistent throughout the whole thing. So again, just use values. This is the big one, and this was the one that kind of I made as a big discovery, and this is a convention that Factory Girl heavily adopts, and most people I don't think realize. I didn't hear this until I listened to a podcast with the engineers of Factory Girl. Is that if you start your test, basically the root level example needs to be the subject needs to be based off of the absolute minimum valid object, minimum valid. Okay, so there's going to be nothing in the code. None of these values are going to contribute, or at least if I was to write the subject here, and it was user, right? This subject right here would be a valid object in whatever representation that meant, either in the Rails convention of what valid actually means, or it's just a valid entity or whatever it is, but it always starts from valid. Now the reason why this matters is because if I know that the base object is a valid object, then as I build my context and my nested examples, I know that I'm always starting from a valid state. I'm not ever starting from a broken state. So when I mutate a value, so when it's too long, I know that if I was to now do this, right, that the only thing that's impacting it right now is that name is too long, right? Again, there's a huge area, room for human error, but if I follow a common convention and I follow the pattern, then it works, okay? And so on. So
and that name is really hard to pronounce. So
that's right. It's not
when last name is hard to pronounce.
That's right.
That's
that one has no vowels.
Yeah, the corollary of that is about the factory itself. Right? The factory should only set things that it has to set.
Yeah. So exactly. So Factory Girl is the whole idea is that your base object, if you have a Factory Girl user, that it is only the attributes that are required to make it valid. You don't include anything else in the factory. And then what you do is you bind, if you have mutations of that, like user without company, then you actually create traits. Are you familiar with traits? Factory Girl traits? Mm-hmm. So effectively what that is that you're just saying, I want to, it's kind of like a mix-in, CSS mix-in, is like, you can't call on a trait specifically. So I couldn't say I want the company trait of a user. No, but I want to take a user factory, and I want to bind to that the trait of having a company, and now that new factory is called user with a company.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm familiar with that. I wasn't familiar with it being called traits, but yeah.
Yeah. So I used to use
factories.
No, so there's extensions where you actually do nesting, and then there's actual like applicable traits that you can pass around.
Does it magically create the names? Like
no, you define it.
Yeah.
So here I'll.
That'd be awesome.
So traits.
I'll show you.
You still have to set, like you have to create the trait and set company to blank or something.
Yeah, I hadn't used it until this project. It's all there are some.
Yeah.
Scrap hug.
Actually, this is probably a really good. Yeah, so as an example, so you'd have a factory, right, user, and then you can specify what a trait on that user would be, okay? Now, in this example, they're creating it, and then the second argument you pass as the trait. Another option is that you actually give it, what is it, factory?
An alias right up there?
Trait.
I think the one you highlighted might have been it. Right
There, that one.
Here? No, where are you looking?
Up, right there.
Right there.
Nope, right there.
You keep saying there. I don't.
Where you
That's where you highlighted.
Oh, here?
Yeah, isn't.
Okay, so this.
That's what I've been.
Yeah. So this is a nested factory.
Oh, it's just an override on the attribute.
That's
down
right.
below that,
That's
right?
right.
The very next one. That one.
Here.
Is that setting up an
no, this
alias?
is aliases.
Creating a new name?
You can. Oh yeah. So you could just. Yeah. So you could. So another way you could do is you could say I want factory user with company to include the trait of such and such.
Yeah, this second example is what I'm used to doing. So why would you? Oh, just so that you can pass it as a second attribute.
Yeah, because then you can. So let's say, for example, you want to dry up your. Because that's the other thing. You get these factories that are crazy and nuts. So you got 50 million of them, whatever. You could dry them up, right? So then you have a trait that you can share amongst them, and again, you have 1 point. 1 point
That's cool.
change. Yeah.
Seems like you could overuse that also, though. So like.
Oh yeah.
To where you're like, I don't even know what this
is anymore.
Testing, yeah.
Yeah. Totally.
Oh, show.
So yeah, so traits are a big one, and yeah. So this is a big component of it is like just make sure that your subject, whatever it is at the very root level and any subsequent level, but definitely at the root level, is a valid object of some kind. And that's what it's going to build. And even I would recommend doing something along this line or something to this effect at the base, right? Something at the very base of that definition that you can just always guarantee when you're running the test that you're working with that of some kind, right? Even if be valid, even if valid isn't a method, find a way to make it just along those lines.
Yeah, and so if like I add a new required field, all of a sudden all my tests are failing, that one thing will be like sort of my key.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh, I better put that in my factory.
Totally.
Right, and it's like everything.
Yeah.
In theory, you're not having to change your test to deal with.
Exactly. So as an example, so if you're dealing everything inside of LUTs and you're controlling, if you're following the pattern, then all you have to do is you have to add one more, the newly required field, you bind it into your subject, and it's done. Right? You don't have to do anything else. And now, if you're like, well, now I want to test against that attribute that I just added or whatever, now I can just go to the bottom of the test and I can say now I can start to add to this test, and I know that everything above it doesn't need to be reviewed. It's all good. El Meco di Senso. Okay.
Which leads right to the next one.
And this is just as a side note. So just making sure that when you write out your expectations that they're clear and easy to understand. So I want an object to be valid, which should not be valid, right? 101 doesn't make any sense, right? And then there's this, which should also kind of be true, but it's the same thing, just flipped into the expect syntax. So just making sure that you're always asserting to true, right? That it is true, the expectation is asserting that it is true. Instead of...
Well, unless you're dealing with, like, false positives, like your truthy situation.
Yeah, that's lame-o.
If you're asserting for true, there's one correct answer.
Yeah.
If you're asserting for false, then it's anything but the correct answer, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
True is true. False is everything else.
Yeah, so here's an example of a test that would fail for multiple reasons. So here's an example of a test so the next piece is always assert to true. So here's an example of a really crappy way to write an expectation, right? So I'm saying I'm expecting it true to not be 0 to be true 1, right? Here's the expect syntax. Same deal, just changed. And so changing it so that you're always asserting to the point of true, right?
Is that a thing? Be invalid?
Yeah.
Does it do magic to call not valid on that?
Yeah.
Really?
For Rails it does, yeah. Yeah, sure does. Kind of cool little fun. So here's an example. Here's an example where if you're trusted, if you're testing for something that's false versus saying I want it to be true, like
Is this in a real project? Where did this come from?
I made this up.
Okay.
Yeah. So as an example, and this kind of goes back to having a minimum valid object, right? Is that in this example, like now this is intentionally a chaotic mess, right? So if in this example we say that, that the first name, it should not be really, really long, and then I've got this expectation that it's not long, right? And then I say, well, is it not valid? And yes, it's not valid, right? It's because it's too long, okay? But then what I do is I come over here and I look at my validations and I go, well, what makes it not valid? That's the real problem, because I could add in another validation here. It's still going to make it invalid, and so this is going to continue to pass, but the problem is that it's not passing for the right reason, or it's not failing for the right reason, right? Mm-hmm. But if instead I was to change this, so I want this to be, I want to test that this is, going back to the valid state, I want to test that it's in a valid state still, or I want to test it in a state where there is only one true answer, then it's going to help prevent issues.
Probably the best test in a case like this would be something like user.errors first name should be present.
Right, right. Yeah, and I've got a fun little example for that too. It's not fun, it's just code, but anyway. Yeah. So I think I kind of covered this, but again, permutations, and you can use context to do permutations, and a lot of this is done using let. As an example, like the thing saw is like last name or first name. You can redefine that, and then you can also play with the permutation of something, the various permutations of it. And you're not having to rebuild objects or any of that sort of stuff. You're just dealing with various contexts. And if you don't know, the kind of common convention is, for the sake of when you are using context, using with or when. So you're saying when this applies with these values, this is this. Another common use case, if you're doing nested context, is the first is with or when, the subsequent are and or then, things like that. Mm-hmm. So when this applies and this applies, such and such. Okay, but it's not required. In fact, you can even use describes and context at the same time. It doesn't matter a ton anymore.
So I think there's an important distinction between context and describe for me. I usually use context when I'm changing the values, the setup, and use describe as a collection of expectations. So if there's not anything changing, if there are no additional lets and there's no before changing anything, it's probably describe.
Totally, totally, yeah, exactly. So like this would be an example of that.
Right.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Does that also mean that typically you have context nested in describes and not necessarily the other way around? Unless you're...
I've always found that the describe generally will sit at the uppermost point, but
you can set up, you could have context at the root level, not the root. The root is going to be the object you're describing about, the class you're describing about. Once you get multi-dimensional about the things that are changing, if you have, let's say you have x and y are both changing, and you want to say context when x is true and y is false, and context when x is true and y is true, and context when x is false and y. Like you can organize those either changing x, x is true, x is false, and then inside of that y is true, y is false. Or you can do it the other way around, and so you can do the same thing with context and describes. Like you could say, here's a describe, or here's a context. Now I'm going to check the show action and the edit action and the whatever index action. Or you could say, I'm testing the index action, and here are the context inside of it. There's really not a strong argument one way or the other, right? Other than to stick to a pattern.
Yeah. Okay, so this is my biggest discovery, and I freaking loved this part, and that was extracting common behaviors. So this is essentially how you dry it up, and this is the use of shared examples, shared context, which are the same.
Oh, they're called shared context also?
Yeah, you can use either or. You can put them in different directories, but they use the exact same code. So they may even be an alias of one another.
Yeah.
So so as an example, the reason why I like it is for two reasons. One of them is it makes it easy to dry up the code. which is fantastic. The other one that is because it allows you the ability to write it in a very declarative way, so it's more it's easier to read and understand. So as an example, I'll show you a more complete. Like this. This would be a valid test. So I'm going to say that I'm going to describe the user and it's going to behave like a user. And then I'm going to say the full name, and I'm going to say it behaves like a full name with these values, and it behaves like a full name with these values, and it behaves like a full name with these values, and just kind of continues down the line. The thing I love about this, and using them in a really, using them a lot, is just simply that it gives me really easy access to mutations or permutations of really simple values. Like as an example, first name, middle name, last name. I want to know that all the same things still apply. It's going to output correctly when it's just first and last. I want to know that it does it when it's only middle and last. I want to know that's right. When it gets into the topic of what you test, I've noticed that more often lately, there's a criticism towards testing these small things, like why would you test these simple string concatenations, right? Like, you know, it's like, why now you've got to write all this test code to just know that the first and last name go together, and middle and last name, which I understand, but it's more kind of a developer happiness concern, because it's like, well, I don't want to spend all the time writing all that code when it's something so simple. So what I like about this is that you can make this really easy on yourself, and you can still test all of that, right? So now I can easily scan these 5 lines here and go, oh, I'm testing all of the permutations here and know that they're all going to work, right? And if I'm missing one, I can easily just come down here and say, oh, it behaves like a full name, right? And this, oh, whoops. And I'm going to say, oh, and this one, I want to make sure it still works the same when it's last name and it's a suffix, right? And now I've got that one covered. It's easy, really easy.
So where do you define your behavior?
Okay, so this is, so inside of shared examples, so you can put them, the convention is to put them in the support directory, and you can create a shared examples directory as well. You don't have to, though. Everything inside of the support directory gets automatically loaded, so it's really preference, but it makes sense to put it inside of a directory. So as an example, so full name with. So one of the downsides of a lot of testing is too much logic, like in the tests themselves. Well, some of the problem is you might have to put logic in there, so then it becomes really messy really fast. So how you define a shared example is you just specify, you just say shared examples for. You could also call them shared context. Again, it's kind of an alias. And the convention is that whatever is passed in, and it does not have to be a string. You could pass anything in right here. You could pass in the actual class entity itself. You could pass in an object if you wanted to, but generally it's a string. And so then that string is going to start with A or N, like it's going to behave like, because it's going to behave like a such and such and such and such, right? Okay. Now, most of the time, developers won't won't utilize the fact that you can pass in additional arguments into the shared example itself, or they won't utilize the metadata that you can pass in as well. And those, in my opinion, can be two of the most powerful things when using them. Most of the time, they're used like this, which is also super valid and fine. And that is I just simply say it behaves like a full name with, pass in a block. And in the block, I can, again, reset these values if I want to, right? And these values get passed in to this example, right? So it's going to overwrite whatever it was, first or middle name and full name. So it's going to overwrite this value, and it's going to overwrite middle name. Okay. And again, the way to do that is that you pass in these lets into the block itself.
So my my biggest concern when doing something like this is like the sense that, wow, should we be testing our tests now, because it's getting pretty, like I could see this extraction happening in a way where you're like having to track stuff down, right? Like you're sort of lost as to where things are. because you can have shared examples inside of shared examples too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. That would be
Never
crazy,
seen
right?
that done.
You can. Like, here's an example. So you say, no, where is it?
It seems like it could get complicated unless you knew the patterns and everyone was using the same patterns.
There you go. Yeah.
So the full name
If
with
this is what you expect, and you know what to expect, then it's probably fine.
Combines. Yeah. So the difficulty I have with this particular one is you're re-implementing the implementation in the let full name.
You're actually concatenating.
You're actually doing the work instead of telling it what it should be. Right. Another way to do this would be shared example for
The logic is
it could
right
take
there.
Some values and then the expected results maybe, because the expected result, this is a good example of when the expected result, the expectation, it's often considered good practice for that to be a literal, like a literal string. Like, it's one thing to say, build this up and check against that it's equal to the thing that you built up. It's another thing to say that it should equal Robert Emerson Head when you pass those three things in, right?
As soon as you introduce logic into there and you're doing if statements and concatenating certain things, like now that's logic. That's the same thing you're testing.
Right.
You're actually like now building into a test that's now your logic in your test.
Well, this is why we read green though. If you get a red and then you change the implementation and you get a green, you can be confident that both your test and your implementation are correct. Right.
Yeah.
It's that initial red that gives you confidence in the test.
Right. I'm just saying that. I mean.
Yeah, it feels like complicated enough that
you just building logic
into
the test. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But that actually is a really good example of when people prefer literals, like a pivotal or whatever. They would prefer to compare against, a string literal because that's the result, not something that was set, right? So anyway, I love the idea of putting the shared examples in the shared examples directory under support. Typically in the past, I've put them in the same file that's using them, if only one file is using them, and then if multiple files are using it, I extract it to another file. But that's a good pattern. Is there a shared examples directory by default in the support directory? No. Okay.
No, because by default it loads everything. So you can put any folder structure in there you want, it'll do them all.
Okay, great. I like it.
I don't think there's anything. And then just declarative expectations, and this was to creating custom matchers. So where's an example of just a horrendous one? Yeah, this one's my favorite. Right. This is where you've got just a ton of logic in that bad boy from hell. And this would be an example of creating a custom matcher or having permission to. Yeah.
Yeah, extracting that so you can write declarative is definitely awesome.
Yeah. I mean, this is bad anyway, on every level possible. But yeah.
Well, it's indented properly. Other than that,
it's indented properly.
Yep.
Yeah. Nice.
So I guess the three big things that I realized help a lot is if you really use lets, like really take advantage of them, they can be really powerful in helping make it easy to extend a test. Like as an example, so where this came from was in SilverCloud we had like a 400-line test or something. It was ridiculous.
One test or one?
Sorry, not one test. Sorry, it was one spec. Yeah, one spec file. It was just massive.
Yeah.
So much so that we couldn't even figure out what parts were being tested, and like it was just a mess, right? But when we just switched things out, we're like, okay, we extracted all of the values.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
into Let's.
Yeah.
We're like, oh, so I know at least what things are being worked with, and then we started writing some custom matchers, cleaned up a lot of the logic that was in there, at least in terms of, so it was easy to like go, oh, I see exactly how things are being tested. Right. And then once we got to that point, there was this kind of baked-in confidence that we could just start extending this test. As long as we follow these patterns, like we can extend it, and we know that we're going to be extending it well, and we're not going to be running into massive issues. And if there are problems, they're not going to be hard to track down. It was a big deal. Yeah.
So my are we at the conclusion?
Yeah.
So my current concern with RSpec is I think it breaks down as a DSL with the new syntax. Like it expect or specify expect, neither of those reads properly. And if it's going to be a domain-specific language, it should read properly. And so they have
expects.
Yeah. So the new one is expected to whatever the.
It is the subject as usual.
So what this
is
says.
expected. So you couldn't say x dot is expected dot, right?
Yeah. So this is the equivalent of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Is expected to. Yeah, that's much better. And that's coming out in RSpec 3.
Wait, where does subject go in there?
You
Or
still.
is expected?
It's implied.
It's implied.
So it's implied at this point,
Yeah, that makes sense.
or you can specify.
Subject is the default receiver of,
Right.
of most of those. Yeah, should. So should is expected is the same as should.
Yeah.
Or
But I
is
don't-
expected
but-
dot 2 is the same as should.
But I don't think you can actually call is expected on an instance like you do with should, because I
Really?
think that's the whole point.
That's the whole point.
They didn't want
They
to
eliminated the
longer-
monkey patching.
Yeah. So that's why everything's wrapped in the expect method, so that they don't have to monkey patch your objects.
Okay.
But
Okay. So you want to be testing the subject then is what you want to be doing. So and you could now say its first name is expected to be whatever, because that changes the subject. Right?
I believe so. I'm not actually. I think
You
Ed.
should be able to do its, yeah. It's like for its first
You've
name
used that,
would be,
yeah.
if the subject is
Yeah.
user, then its first name would be.
I think this is dead. I think they've killed it.
But it should be is expected dot 2 would work, yeah.
Its first name is expected to.
I think it's not
Oh.
that.
I thought they. I thought they actually killed it. Hold on. Let us look, shall we? RSpec
It's-
3.
The return of its.
Let's see if there's any fun release notes
I
here.
mean, I've been using that for a couple of years, but I like it a lot. Using subjects is really,
Yeah. Change.
It just feels a lot cleaner
Yeah.
if you're using it the way it was supposed to be used.
yeah.
This is not an easy way to see it.
And just RSpec its.
there was a blog post recently for release candidate 1 of RSpec 3, I think, that super detailed.
Or should it be? This?
Release candidate, yeah.
Alright. Canada.
And
Wow.
the date.
That's a-
That's spelling right? Yeah?
Yeah.
Data 2.
It's either that one or there might be a post after that.
Full change log.
That's the
Is
299.
expected.
Deprecations.
Look for
Scroll down to
Well,
the.
deprecations was right there. It's
But this is just
Look
the
for-
299 one though.
look for release candidate 1.
Oh,
I think it was actually like this month too.
Is 299 basically 3.0 with the old syntax or something?
Hmm?
oh, that's good. It's probably audio though.
I
No,
suspect.
go to the one above that. Maybe.
It's fairly
That's Rails
cool.
4.
Oh, never mind.
I think that blog post you were in down lower would have had it. It had the 299.
The last one?
The one,
That one.
the first link there. Just scroll down past the 299.
Yeah.
See, it says core 299, and then keep going
Keep
down.
going down.
Keep going down, 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 down.
There you go.
There it is. Okay.
Hello.
Breaking changes.
Looks to me like it still has its. That's good news.
Maybe remove support for. Use.
Yep. An example runtime.
Remove support for specifying document format using ads.
Yeah, I like this. So this is beta 2 right now. We could start using it in our main projects.
I think RC1 though came out a couple months after this. But can you get to like the root of that blog?
That blog. Give me that.
China music licenses.
Notable changes in RSpec 3.
Yeah, that just came out.
You're dead, Ruby 186.
That's the one.
And
This
100.
thing is super detailed about everything.
That was a new gem.
It seems like they put in backwards compatibility for most everything. You can.
So how do they implement backwards compatibility without the same?
Well, that's probably monkey patches everything if you want to.
Probably set a flag.
Right,
Yeah.
or you might have to pull in a gem even. I'm not sure.
They're
Right.
really not. You think with Ruby,
Zero.
There's
match
enough
mode.
meta-programming power that you could
Oh yeah, it is
use
flag.
whatever syntax you want without.
Disable monkey patching.
Much of the
That's pretty
groundwork
straightforward.
was laid in recent. Added the new expect-based syntax. Yeah. So I guess it is all still in there.
Is should deprecated, or does it still works?
If you disable monkey patching, yeah. Oh, you can name it. Does it do that? No.
What I do is I thank David Kaminski for.
Where? What?
Thanks to David Chemlinski. What idea are they talking about right there? Scroll up a little bit. Remove the example method. Instance is yielded.
Yields the example as an argument to the block.
Yeah, I've never quite understood why you would ever want to do this, but yeah, you can use example, and then you can pull the metadata from the example itself, like the description. I don't know why you do that.
Maybe if you're writing, if you're using like metaprogramming to write your tests. So like say you want to write a bunch of expectations that check different combinations.
Like X is true and Y is false, things like that.
Yeah, but like if you had something really complicated, like kind of what you were doing with all different possibilities of first name, last name, suffix, like if instead of doing those different scenarios manually, you wrote a program that just tested every possible example or every possible combination, so you could change the name, the names of the specs. I don't know, something weird like that.
Have you seen those examples that have the table data?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's some in Breeze.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm not a fan of it
Is
at
that
all.
an RSpec now? I thought it was
No,
on
Cucumber. Cucumber.
You're right. You're right.
Oh, where you like have the weird like
you build
inline
tables.
box.
Yeah.
I think that's
It's great for some things, like because you're like, hey, I want to test all these different variations.
Sure,
Right,
it's
it's like-
great. It's just
it's like-
it's the wrong tool. Like it,
I don't
it's
know.
perfect. It's like, hey, when X is this and Y is this, you should get this. When X is this and Y is that, you should get that.
Right.
You just make a
Exactly for that.
table.
It's even worse if you have X, Y, Z, and if you have multiple variables. The worst thing I've seen about structuring tests is when you're trying to create multiple contexts in multiple dimensions, and it gets really confusing about like, should I have context for X first and then Y and then Z, or all of them together? Should I make it flat and change them and then have to remember all the combinations? And then
That's
You know,
where
it
this-
just gets insane. Because if you're like, okay, I have to have a context for y is true and y is false, inside the x is true and inside the x is false. And wait, now I need 2 for z in each of those. And you can, and if you make it a table, it's much, much simpler. You can
Yeah.
say these
Yeah.
3 values equal this
It's
result.
like you think of it like testing just a function. It's like the function
Right.
takes 3 arguments.
It returns
You
a
know,
result.
if
Right.
past these 3 arguments, I should get this result. If past these 3 arguments, I should get this result.
Right, exactly.
It's like just all the different possibilities. One shot.
All right, y'all.
Yeah, thanks, Adam.
Yeah, thanks. That was awesome.
You got it.
So what do we want as ZEAL? I think some